Welcome to Pamoja Podcast, a ministry of Life of Christ International Ministries. Here, we build stronger lives, deeper faith, and Christ-centered homes. One story, one message, and one revelation at a time. I'm your host, Mwamba. Today, I want to introduce you to a subject that has been hidden in plain sight throughout the entire Bible. A subject that explains not simply why people fall, but how they get there. Because very few people wake up one morning and decide to abandon God. Very few faithful believers suddenly become unfaithful. Very few committed disciples make one decision and instantly walk away from Christ. Something happens long before the visible fall. There is an invisible journey, a gradual movement, a quiet departure, a slow relocation of the heart. The Bible has a name for it: drifting. And today, I want to introduce what I believe is the theology of spiritual drift. Not a new doctrine, not a new revelation that replaces Scripture, but a biblical framework that helps us understand a pattern found from Genesis to Revelation. Because one question has always fascinated me: why do strong believers drift away? How does someone who once burned with passion slowly lose the fire? How does someone who once defended truth become silent? How does someone who once loved God's presence find themselves comfortable living without it? How does Peter, the disciple who declared, "You are the Christ," later deny that he even knew him? How does Solomon, the man who asked for wisdom, finish his life surrounded by idols? How does Demas, a faithful companion of Paul, end up loving the present world? These are not stories of instant rebellion. They are stories of gradual drift. And perhaps that is exactly why they are so dangerous. Because drift is almost always invisible while it is happening. Imagine a boat, not tied to the dock, no engine running, no storm, no explosion, no dramatic event, just untied. Little by little, the current begins carrying it away. No one notices at first. The movement is almost impossible to detect. But give it enough time, and the boat is nowhere near where it once belonged. That is spiritual drift. It doesn't begin with a scandal. It doesn't begin with public sin. It begins with unnoticed distance. That is why one of the greatest laws of the Christian life is this: everything left unattended drifts. A marriage drifts. A friendship drifts. A ministry drifts. A church drifts. A prayer life drifts. A heart drifts. Not because someone decided to destroy it, but because someone stopped protecting it. Hebrews tells us we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away. Notice the warning. The writer never says, lest someone pushes you away. He says, lest we drift away. Sometimes, our greatest enemy is not persecution. It is neglect. The tragedy of spiritual drift is that it usually feels harmless until the distance has become enormous. Which leads us to another principle. God measures drift by direction more than distance. A heart rarely moves away from God in giant leaps. It moves, 1 degree at a time, one neglected prayer, one ignored conviction, one compromised decision, one quiet excuse, one hidden thought, one surrendered standard. And eventually, what once shocked us becomes normal. But perhaps the greatest discovery of all is this: distance often precedes denial. Before Peter denied Jesus, he followed him at a distance. The denial did not begin around the fire. It began when he became comfortable with the distance. Then Peter found himself standing among people who rejected Jesus. When he was recognized, fear entered his heart. And suddenly, he concealed his identity. "I don't know the man." That statement reveals one of Satan's oldest strategies. The enemy's first objective is rarely to make you openly reject Christ. His first objective is to make you quietly hide him. Hide your convictions, hide your faith, hide your obedience, hide your identity. Because sin usually begins with concealed identity before it becomes visible behavior. Jesus understood this. That is why he said, "If anyone is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory with his Father and the holy angels. Notice carefully. Jesus didn't simply say, me. He said, me and my words. Because you cannot separate Christ from his truth. The culture has always attempted to convince believers to keep Jesus while hiding his word, or to defend his word without publicly belonging to Jesus. But discipleship has never worked that way. Our identity and his truth cannot be separated. That is why spiritual drift is first an identity problem before it ever becomes a behavior problem. The enemy understands something that many believers forget. Identity shapes behavior. If he can convince you to stop living openly as someone who belongs to Christ, your behavior will eventually follow your hidden identity. This is why drift is so dangerous. It whispers instead of shouts. It persuades instead of attacks. It invites instead of forces. It says, just this once. Don't make it awkward. Stay quiet. Blend in. No one needs to know. Little by little, the distance grows. And one day, people call it a fall. God calls it the end of a long drift. But here is the beautiful news. The purpose of this theology is not condemnation. It is recognition. Because Peter drifted, but Peter returned. The prodigal drifted, but he returned. David drifted, but he returned. The grace of God is greater than the distance we create. Yet his desire has never been merely to restore us after we drift. His desire is to teach us to recognize the current before it carries us away. Throughout this series, we are going to uncover the invisible laws that govern spiritual drift, the warnings, the stages, the subtle compromises, the forgotten disciplines, the battle for identity, and the path back to wholehearted devotion. Because people rarely abandon Christ in one decision. They simply stop choosing him in 1,000 small ones. And perhaps the greatest danger facing the church today is not open rebellion. It is becoming comfortable with the distance. Welcome to the Theology of Spiritual Drift,